And indeed, since Alaska, we seem to be, or Putin seems to be increasing his rate of strikes, not reducing them. And what's extraordinary is that he's very brazenly hit American economic targets. He hit the Flex
Yes.
factory and then a logistics center as well, and then the EU office.
Robert Seely MBE was a British Conservative Party politician who served as the Member of Parliament MP for the Isle of Wight from 2017 until the constituency was split in two in 2024. He is a former journalist and soldier. From 1990 to 1995, he worked as foreign correspondent in the last years of the USSR and in post-Soviet states. From 2008 to 2017, he served in the British Armed Forces in Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, and the ISIS campaigns. Sealey has been a research associate at the Changing Character of War programme at the University of Oxford. And today I'm absolutely delighted because I got my hands on this quite a while ago before I went on holiday. But today we're going to be exploring his unique definition of Russian hybrid war and his highly impactful book, The Total War, From Child Abduction to Cyber Attacks and Drones to Disinformation. Russia's conflict with Ukraine and the West, and I cannot recommend this too highly. It really lays out in stark terms what we are in, the total full-scale war with Russia on many different fronts. Is it all right to call you Bob Seely or Robert Seely?
But most people call me Bob. My mother called me Bobby, and I was Bobby in childhood. And I think sort of Bob became more blokey. It's probably useful for politics. I'm only Robert when people tell me off, I think, as far as I can see.
This is me too. I'm Jonathan when I was being rebuked by my father, and now it's John. So we'll stick to Bob. Let's have a look at the book because I really want to dig into your inspiration for writing this.
Yeah.
But it's got one of the most stunning covers of any of the books that's come out during the full-scale war. So let's have a little peek at that.
I don't know if you can see it there.
We can
The
see it
lady,
perfectly. Yeah,
the
that's absolutely
lady,
brilliant.
the lady on the front cover, John, is she's a sniper. She was a former Latin teacher from Lviv in the west of Ukraine. Her call sign is Panushka. She is incredibly charming and sort of very dedicated to her role. And I only met her because I was going to send condolences and wanted to do it in person because I'd met her partner who and her fiance, Sasha, who was a lieutenant colonel of the tsunami unit based in Odessa. And the irony of their lives was that despite the fact that she goes into no man's land twice a week, maybe, sometimes more, sometimes less, in order to kill her enemy, he was in Odessa, in his office, in the regimental office, when the regimental office was struck twice by missiles, Russian missiles. And in the second strike, which was the a double tap. So, you strike once, you get the emergency services or people like Sasha who went along to help, and then you strike again. He was killed. And despite her extraordinary military role, she was telling me that the most difficult thing she's done in this war was to bury Sasha.
Of course, it's incredibly moving, isn't it, being on the ground, actually meeting people who are under fire, meeting their family who worry about them every day. But it works both ways. I mean, those people in cities are still at risk
Yeah.
as well, and you get this sort of horrific stories. And every day in Lviv, for instance, there are several large churches, and you'll see a military funeral. I won't say almost every day. You will see one every day, possibly from all of the main denominations as well.
No, I quite agree, and I mean, and you're right. Even in Lviv, there are regular strikes now, and indeed, since Alaska, we seem to be, or Putin seems to be increasing his rate of strikes, not reducing them. And what's extraordinary is that he's very brazenly hit American economic targets. He hit the Flex
Yes.
factory and then a logistics center as well, and then the EU office and the British Council.
British Council.
If
And the one that doesn't get mentioned is the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, who a friend of mine keeps reminding me to mention that one as well, because that's highly symbolic too.
Absolutely. He says he's basically destroying. He's saying to the West, if you think you're going to invest in Ukraine, don't bother because I'm going to destroy your investments. So absolutely, I think what's happening there is truly frightening. The way that he's escalating this war, and not even Jane Austen is safe. What can you say?
It's extraordinary, isn't it? And the irony, of course, is that Putin, and this is a nice lead, I think, into your book. I mean, Putin hitting the European Bank of Reconstruction and Development. When I was in Russia, they had some pretty prominent projects right at the start of the 90s, helping to rebuild Russia, helping to lift Russia back off its knees after the collapse of the USSR. And yet now we have this narrative that NATO simply wanted to roll over Russia's interests, that we've always wanted to degrade and destroy Russia, that there is no alternative but full-scale conflict, and that's an endless story, an endless state of warfare between the West. This is an invented narrative, surely, and it certainly doesn't accord with what I experienced there in the 90s.
Yes, it's pretty much an invented narrative. And in fact, okay, so what I try to do in the book, I've tried to do two things. One, I tell the stories of people, and that's Ukrainians who are fighting the war, whether it's Panushka, who's on the front cover, whether it's doctors in Kharkiv, whether it is, soldiers on the front line, or whether it is children being stolen by the Russian state. And child stealing is an important tactic within this war, in this form of war. So, as well as telling individual stories that exemplify the broader themes, I'm also telling the story of the evolution of Russian warfare, but also why it's very important for this century, because what Russia's reinvention of integrated total war is going to be, I think, a template for dictators and authoritarian rulers for this century, and how they take on and try to undermine Western societies, but also more generally free societies. So the book is a story of an idea, but it's also told partly through the stories of people. And as you say, one of the things that Putin has done is reinvent the need for an enemy. And that enemy is us. In fact, it wasn't NATO. Let's remember that the crisis in 2013 was caused by the European Union, well, the Ukraine's negotiations towards having a new deal with the European Union, and the Russians felt that if that was going to happen, that would have a significant impact on taking Ukraine out of quotes unquotes their sphere of interest. So yes, absolutely. And in fact, as I say, what I do, I talk about the reinvention of Russian strategy, about the reinvention of a threat, about the reinvention also of the tools of war, and the politics and the information warfare and the economic warfare. They're all part of these non-military tools of war, Jonathan.
Before we move on to the next question, I'd like to make a personal recommendation that I know you will appreciate. You may have seen my interview last week with the producer of the film series Kiev of Mine, Ronnie Apteker. Well, I've partnered with them to help raise awareness of what I believe is an important series of films made for a Western audience to help break through absurd stereotypes about Ukraine, some of which, of course, are amplified by Russian propaganda. You can watch these films for free now. Details in a second. Kiev of Mine is a documentary series about Ukraine's extraordinary capital, which I had the privilege to visit for the first time in January this year. The film production began in 2018, and of course, much has changed since then. It's now 2025, and the story is far from over. Kiev of Mine is a fast-paced, beautifully filmed, humorous, fun, insightful, heartbreaking, moving, and hopeful work. The very antithesis, in fact, of a doom-laden and worthy wartime documentary. This is a work that is extraordinarily uplifting. My friend, operator Starsky, says the film is made with so much love. The film series will make you laugh and cry. It's the only film about Ukraine that began before the war yet has traced lives through the tumultuous times, and which follows the lives of more than a dozen Ukrainians in real time. This is an historic period told through highly personal and emotive stories from Kiev's days of emerging prosperity after the Maidan Revolution through COVID and the full-scale invasion. This film is a breath of fresh air. Ukraine deserves a better conversation in the world, one that isn't centered around war, says Jolyon Ellis, filmmaker on Kiev of Mine. It's hard not to argue with that, and the filmmakers have fully delivered on this promise. This is essential watching for anyone who calls themselves pro-Ukrainian, but I think it's also vital to get friends, colleagues, and family to watch it too, because the reality is few people have a vivid impression of Ukraine or any direct connection with its people. War is inhumane and abstract. Building an alternative perception is essential for engaging the world with the importance of Ukraine's struggle. Historians don't use the phrase inevitable because, well, for a whole variety of reasons.
Yeah.
But it does seem to me, having seen the mechanics of various dictators, watching the news over a number of decades, there seems to be an almost inevitable mechanic where regimes that rely on coercion and terror, as Putin certainly has done, and he used that fairly surgically in the early years of his regime, well, if you exclude the apartment bombings,
Mhm.
there comes a point where actually the resistance to your regime increases, and perhaps your regime becomes less, not just less tolerant, but less efficient, less effective. So it's an almost inevitable cycle of increasing resistance. So where we're at the moment, is this in some ways almost inevitable? Because if you can't change your leaders, if you have someone in power for 25 years, and there's constant need to double down and consolidate, you're going to need to invent external enemies. Is this the real problem? Are we dealing with a succession or the lack of a succession mechanism in Russia, and it all flows from that? Or is it something a lot deeper, that Russia is a historically militaristic state and is just reverting to type?
Okay, that's fascinating. There's a bunch of questions there, so I'm going to try to take as many as I remember. When it comes to a military state, yeah, look, I think it is true to say that Russia is a highly militarized state and always has been, and I think we forget that. When it comes to the creation of an enemy, I think you're absolutely right. When it comes to the inevitability, I'm really wary of inevitability because if you had gone back to 2000, 2005, 2010, and if you'd said this is inevitable, everyone, especially the sort of great and good and the people who repeat conventional wisdom, would have said this is absolutely ridiculous. Of course, it's not going to be. And the sadness is that nobody, even when the Russians started this new form of warfare against the West and against Ukraine, nobody understood what was happening, not even in Ukraine. So one of the problems is when you're fighting with primarily non-military tools, but you believe you are in conflict, you can get away with a lot because people, Western societies, open societies, don't think they're at war unless they see people attacking them effectively with tanks and planes and the tools of what we understood to be, old school conventional war. And I argue a series of arguments in my book, and one of them is that Putin's created this new form of integrated war that and if you look at Russian doctrine, and this is all Russian, so much of this book is Russian source based because so many people talk without reference to the source material and to Russian doctrine. But if you look at Russian doctrine, the number one characteristic of modern warfare, modern conflict, is the unification of military and non-military tools. And they give examples of information, economic, political, and other measures, sort of special operations, so cyber attacks, espionage, what people might have called in back in the day active measures. And there's a chapter on the evolution of active measures as well. But from the military theorist point of view, what he's specifically done is he's taken Russia's two ways of war of the 20th century and merged them into a single understanding of military doctrine. Now, one of those ways of war, the political warfare, the warfare of the KGB and the Communist Party, we do not see as a form of warfare, as a form of conflict. And I think one of the things I say in the book is that we should. So you had the War of the Red Army, conventional war, and the Soviets did a lot of very impressive theoretical work in the 20s and 30s until they were all killed off by Stalin, and a number of the military leaders who were sort of Svechins and other people who invented or developed ideas like operational art and deep battle theory in order to create a sort of more holistic sense of what you were doing with your conventional armies. But there was a second way of war as well, and that was the active measures, subversive political warfare of the KGB and the Communist Party. One was known in Russian as Vana, and the other one, I can't roll my R, so you pronounce this much better than I would, Jonathan, was known as ideological struggle, and struggle is Baba. And so what Putin has done is effectively united war and struggle, Vina and Baba, into a single whole.
Hmm. Barba. There we go. I had
Thank
to
you.
show off, didn't I? That's
Sorry, please, I'm so glad you did because when I say Baba, people think I'm talking about that French elephant that you read
yes.
when you were a kid.
Well, I thought of the pastry, the very first one I tried in St. Petersburg, which is a rumova baba, which
Lovely.
is the rum baba. Um, there's going to be a number of areas, I think, which historians are going to seriously fight over here. And I
Yeah,
can already see some of this unfolding in conversations with Mark
yeah,
Galeotti and others. One is that, and Mark Galeotti's argument would be that actually Putin fell into the little green men bit. You know, he fell into the invasion, the incremental invasion of Donbass. He was dragged by his inability to make strategic decisions and his willingness to outsource violence to, I guess, privateers, as it were. And that then had a logic that sort of dragged him in, which was inescapable. That sounds almost like I mean, it doesn't get him off the hook for his actions, but it sounds like, he's created a mechanism which he barely controls and barely aware of. And yet the other argument is to say,
I,
well,
I'm getting. I've
you've
got
got the
shoes.
doctrines which
Yeah.
are so specific and so structured that that's not accidental. This confrontation with the West and everything we've seen is not an accidental process. I think that's going to be a big area of.
It is, and I look. I mean, I'm hugely respectful of Mark, and I'm so glad that he was very generous in some of the comments about the book. So I'm not going to sort of give him a hard time. Although I will take issue with some of the stuff that he says. I don't think he fell into it. I think this was, there was heavy investment in. If you talk to Ukrainians in Kharkiv elsewhere who were monitoring and seeing what was happening, there were some people. Really, from 2005 onwards, from the Orange Revolution onwards, there was a systematic sea change and a systematic attempt by the Kremlin to bring Ukraine back into a Belarusian variant, a Belarusian option, where effectively you have a veneer of independence, but not a lot else. And so one of the other things I argue in the book is I don't date the war from 2022, and I don't even date the war from 2014. The conflict, the Ukraine conflict started in 2005 after the Orange Revolution, where there began to be a systematic campaign. Now, some people would say actually the Russians were, they went straight on the offensive after 1991. Yeah, and they point to stuff like I think a Swedish institute, one of their military institute in Sweden, FOI, I think, said that there were 50 attempts by the Russians to use gas and the politics and the economics of gas to manipulate and intimidate Ukraine. And that may or may not be true. I suspect it is true. But a single ministry or a single entity trying to manipulate, even if you've got the FSB doing stuff in Crimea, etc., does not equate to a systematic campaign. But my argument is after 2005, there was a systematic campaign. And the first phase of the war, 2005 to 2013, was a conflict primarily driven by non-military measures. So economics, the use of oligarchs, the information campaigns, the buying up of newspaper groups in Ukraine, the corruption of the entire political class, etc., etc. All of this was to both present Ukraine as a failed state or a failing state, whilst at the same time effectively buying it. There will be people who will be listening to this and then saying, yeah, but that's not war. And to which I'd say you're both right and you're wrong. By our standards, that is not war. And by most people's standards, including in Ukraine, that is not war. The problem is with that definition is that according to Russia and the military doctrine of the Russian Federation, that is one of the characteristics of modern conflict. Economic, political, informational warfare is one of the characteristics of modern conflict. So the Russians, in the eyes of the Kremlin and the people who were fighting this conflict, they were in conflict from 2005, whether we care to admit that or not. And we don't if we judge war by our more restricted and much more conservative definitions, rather than the definition that not only the Russians, but also the Iranians and the Chinese will put on definitions of conflict in this coming century.
And of course, we have to ask, were Russians doing those equivalent investments, trying to buy off politicians, trying to create criminal networks and invest in particular oligarchs to coerce and corrupt the state? Were they doing that in every country of the world, or actually are they focusing on a few specific territories? And I think the answer has to be they're focusing on those countries that they actually want to destabilize, weaken, coerce,
Yeah.
and control.
I mean, they were using quite a few territories. So you could argue they were doing the same in the UK, but within the confines of the rules that they were setting themselves. So, Russian warfare, Russian ideas of conflict are designed to be efficient. Why assassinate, why invade a country when you can assassinate? Why attack Georgia again when actually with a few oligarchs you can pretty much buy it, the same with Moldova, etc., etc. So, there is an argument saying that they try to behave efficiently and also in a targeted way with a different set of rules for wherever they operate. But they were operating in France and the United States, and you hear all these rumors about President Trump, and they were doing the same here, using their lawyers to intimidate and silence journalists, some of whom I'm sure you've had on your program, and your excellent YouTube program, and they will have been silenced for a purpose. Not silence in the sense of being murdered, but silence in the sense of effectively being financially silenced, financially destroyed by Russian oligarchs. But it's the same effective process of you're in conflict and you're using the tools in the countries where you then set your limits on what you're willing to do. But you're certainly active in those countries. But clearly in Ukraine, you had a country where pretty much everything was within limits, apart from thus far nuclear weapons.
And of course, people say, well, when does this date to? And they'll point to the books like Spin Dictators and so on, and it pushes the date back to relatively recently. But actually, I think if we look at moves to take over NTV, to essentially deprive satirists like Shinderovich and others of an income, they found their own income in the private sphere, but to deny them sort of state assets, then Putin's informational autocracy started very early in the early 2000s, 2003, really. It was already, well in train. Then we turn to Ukraine, because again, if we take the argument that Putin fell into this war, there's something else that doesn't make sense here. And this really ties in with child stealing and these other bits in your book here. And this is the not just the informational campaign, but the sort of genocidal forming of identity, shaping the West as an enemy, but in particular shaping Ukraine as an enemy. Because it seems to me that period 2005 to 2013, there's an ever increasing intensity and sophistication in depicting Ukrainians from just being sort of a certain traditional caricatures that were in sort of racist tropes, but then manipulating and using those to form a much more, I would say, genocidal
Mhm.
purpose behind it. And a lot of Ukrainians I've spoken to who are actually working in the Russian media sphere certainly started to feel this in the 2000s, and it really sped up after Bolotna in 2012.
Yeah, in fact, I mean, I think one of the people look at Brat Devar, the film Brat Devar, with a lot of sort of crude, sort of Russian stereotyping of Ukrainians there, and it's a much quoted film, but also Sea Devils, which was one of the first thriller series on Russian TV, where you basically had Russian special forces operating in the near abroad to protect Russians. And the good people of those countries from nasty separatists, neo-Nazis, criminals, etc., etc. All very ironic given the regime in Russia at the time. The idea fell into the war. No, again, sorry. Let's challenge that. Um, Putin was in conflict from 2005. He lost control of Ukraine at the end of 2013. He'd succeeded in getting Yanukovych to reject the EU offer, and the Russians never thought the EU offer would go very far. And they were absolutely shocked to find a deal had been ironed out between Ukraine and the European Union, this sort of deep and long-term relationship sort of thing. And then they panicked and they got Yanukovych down to Sochi and, basically read him the riot act and said, "You're not doing this. You're coming back into the fold, and you're doing this now." So they reject the EU treaty. You then had Maidan, the revolution of dignity, tens of thousands of people out on the streets in central Kiev, the breakdown in law and order, and the breakdown of the Yanukovych regime. Yanukovych then flees. So Russia loses control. And if you go back, Jonathan, to the Russian theory of war, it's very similar to the old KGB theory of destabilization, except the modern Russian methodology, as outlined by Valery Gerasimov, has 6 stages and not 4 stages. But effectively, it's sort of long-term subversion, bringing to crisis, and then normalization under a new regime is roughly the four. And the Russians have simply, the modern Russian state has simply divided two of those phases up. And so you have two additional phases. But they had lost control. So what did Putin do? He then had to escalate in order to try to regain control of the situation. And so what he did, not only in Crimea, but in eastern Ukraine, Crimea was very successful, eastern Ukraine, not really successful, although they got a foothold in two oblasts in Donetsk and Lugansk. They escalated this crisis, going through effectively the motions of organizing a coup d'etat. So people out in the streets, people protesting, it turns violent, surprise, surprise. All of a sudden you have paramilitaries, and the next thing you have, 50, 100 tanks. Where do they come from? Nobody knows. But sort of friendly separatists who've got access to vast amounts of kit by Western standards.
And book systems, which of course everyone knows took down
And
the airliner.
exactly. And so he lost control in 13, and in 14 he escalated in order to regain control. In 2022, it was going nowhere, so he escalated again to a full-scale invasion. Although this was not necessarily a fighting invasion, it was effectively a glorified coup d'etat where the threat of Russian arms would allow the FSB, the GRU operatives in Kiev to effectively assassinate who they needed to, and in order to put in place a supplicant regime.
And that's interesting, of course, because they laid the groundwork for this. They thought they had compliant networks, they thought they had compliant intelligence officers, but then push came to shove. It seems that many of them didn't act on Moscow's orders.
No, I mean they were being paid quite healthily, a lot of them, but effectively the attitude of some was that if you're dumb enough to give us money to feed you information, we'll take the money. But when they then saw the Russian tanks coming over the hill, they thought, well, this is changing, and suddenly my relationship to what I want to do has changed. You're right, but again, the problem here is that Putin, as far as I understand, and I've had explained to me by people in the Ukrainian security forces, when Putin started to go through the motions for a crisis in 2022 of some kind, and the Ukrainians were expecting war in the east. They weren't expecting a wholesale attack. So they were expecting the Russians, worst case scenario, the Russians make considerable headway in eastern Ukraine and put the Ukrainian state under massive political pressure because it's losing a war in the east of its territory. Russia overextends, invades everywhere, and clearly then, as we understand, fails. But the interesting sort of dynamic beneath that is that whilst Russia was building up to to the conditions for a new coup, so chaos in the streets, Russia comes in as peacekeeping, there wasn't enough time for the FSB and the GRU to do that planning for that scenario. And from my understanding, Putin decides at relatively short, very short notice, a few days, and say, actually, let's just go in now. And he gives the order for that to happen. So since then, a lot of people have been blamed for the failure. They've all been put under house arrest of sorts, but nothing worse, because ultimately the person who made this decision and didn't allow the FSB and the GRU time to build up the sort of coup d'etat scenario and variant was Putin himself.
And of course, something that's been fascinating for me throughout the full-scale invasion is that just because it's turned kinetic and it's escalated to the next stage, that doesn't mean you don't have coups, subversion, provocations taking place at the same time. Yes, we know there's been attempted assassinations in Ukraine, but there's also been extensive attempts to subvert and degrade democracies throughout Europe, subvert democratic processes, and try to install Kremlin-friendly regimes. Do you see that as a process whereby they're trying to win the Ukraine war by doing that, by surrounding Ukraine with states that are no longer cooperative? Or is Putin still got maximalist aims here to degrade and destroy NATO, to erode the EU, and eventually degrade it to a point where it ceases to exist?
It's not an either or, Jonathan. I think he's trying to do both. So if you look at since late 2022, the Russians have had a three-pronged strategy. One of which is to hold the line. So they dug some sort of vastly deep sort of ditches, effectively moats along the front line at the late 2022 and early 2023. And from there, they then proceeded to slowly grind down the Ukrainian front lines, having secured their own. The second thing they've tried to do is to make life hell for Ukrainians on an everyday basis, so destroying the electricity infrastructure. And the third thing they've tried to do is to break the link between Ukraine and its Western backers. And one of the ways they're doing that is by the US administration, if they can do so. And the other way they're doing that is by information war in Moldova, in Scandinavian countries, in Romania, in Georgia, etc., in order to try to spread political confusion, if they can, political chaos in certain Western states, and clearly the support in Slovakia and Hungary and those relationships, which maybe, how can we put this, rather economic, I think are also clearly aimed at fracturing Western unity over the Ukraine invasion. And I can't say it's not working. Sorry to put it in a double negative, but I think Putin is not failing at the moment. And I think broadly he's succeeding more than he was a year ago. And unfortunately, the West is becoming fractured on this, not only because of President Trump, but Slovakia and Hungary as well. And there's been significant sort of political warfare operations in Moldova, in Georgia, where else? In Romania. And so, Putin is very, very active, and he has three
Even
aims.
in Poland, I mean, a certain amount of unity has been significantly eroded, and Russian operations are not absent, including the ones that play on historical grievance and mythology.
Yeah, I mean, I quote one of there was an NGO set up by the Russians in order to specifically create friction between the Ukrainians and the Poles over, some contested elements of history, of which there are many, as we know, in Eastern Europe, and many and quite a few between the Poles and the Ukrainians. Putin has three aims in his life now. One of which is the creation of a virulently anti-Western Russia, which he's more or less succeeded at, certainly for the moment. Secondly, is to destroy genuinely independent Ukraine, and he's continuing to try to do that. It's in the balance, I'd say. And the third thing is he wants to break the power of the West and NATO. So you listen to him today at the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the SCO, in China. You listened to him in Alaska last week. He is doing everything that he can in order to divide and break and weaken the West, potentially for a physical military challenge in the Baltic republics. And the problem with the dictators is that they always end up losing power by overreaching themselves, but they do a great deal of damage on the way. So I can't say that he's not going to do that. And I think sadly, considering his behavior, it is more likely than not that he will either escalate, small chance to nuclear weapons, which I know a lot of Ukrainians think is overrated, the risk. It can be sometimes exaggerated, but it's not negligible. But also potentially in the Baltics. And I do think that he will eventually overextend himself, and that is a great danger for us all.
It certainly seems that way, and I think the very idea that something is inconceivable doesn't mean it won't happen. Indeed, the full-scale invasion of Ukraine was inconceivable to
It was.
most people.
It was. And,
Um,
and, and the problem is, the other problem, Jonathan, is that whenever anyone says, Putin won't do that, would he? Or he can't possibly do that, can he? So far, he's unfortunately done those things that everyone thought, as you say, were inconceivable.
And I think one of the other problems as well, and I mean, certainly the Germans have had this until recently, until Merz has got a healthy dose of reality. And we, to an extent, we're a little more cynical, but we have this as well. We tend to try and think the best of other people.
Yeah.
We have real problems, I think, imagining or understanding the absolute depths that human behavior,
Mm.
as history demonstrates, is possible. And we massively underestimate, I would say, the toxicity of Russia.
Mm.
I try to use an analogy. Imagine if the SS and the KGB
Yeah.
had a baby and
Yeah.
and now run a state without any checks and balances.
Yeah.
The origins of the Russian regime, and indeed the clique that's running it now in the KGB. I mean, there is no limit to the cynicism and violence that they can perpetrate.
No, it is extraordinary, given their sort of alleged love of Russia, quite how debased their culture is. And the problem is, and again, we don't quite grasp this because we sort of think socialism was about being nice about people, blah, blah, blah. And okay, we think totalitarian socialism was a bit nastier, but we don't. Even now, we don't really put it on a moral par with Nazism, and yet for me, there's no doubt that it was a moral par. That whether you were mass murdered in the name of class or the name of race, you were still mass murdered. In the last century, there were two genocidal regimes. They may have genocidally murdered on different grounds, but they still genocidally murdered. One of those regimes, Nazi Germany, was more or less purged through the Nuremberg trials, through the democratization of Western Germany, through admittance of guilt, etc. Russia has never gone through that sort of moral cleansing process. And those people who have committed those vast and heinous crimes, the Communist Party, the KGB, now the FSB, they have never really accepted the nature or indeed the scale of the harm that was done to the Russian people, but also the Ukrainians and all the other ethnic groups within Russia. And what that's why it went from being a prisoner of nations to a graveyard of nations. I can't remember who that quote's from, but it was very apt.
That sounds like my friend David Satter might have come out something like that. That's got a certain ring to it. Um, And back to this issue of intentionality, I think one of the really interesting things that you have studied and tried to sort of raise the awareness of was the Surkov leaks,
Yeah.
because obviously that's not the entirety of his correspondence. It's just a sort of small shard of what one assumes is the total correspondence somewhere on record we'll probably never get to see. What did that actually show? What did it show about the mechanics and the intentionality of the invasion of Ukraine in all of its different stages and permutations?
I did before I did this book. I did. Thank you for mentioning, Jonathan. I did a report with a lady called Alia Chandra from the Euromaidan Press, and she'd got hold of the Circle of Leaks. She'd been given it by Ukrainian hackers, and we did a report for RUSI, for the Royal United Services Institute, on it. It's good of them to publish. The most valuable thing about the Circle of Leaks was that it showed the sort of nuts and bolts of political warfare as being planned by Surkov and being planned by the Kremlin. According obviously to the leaks, which nobody has ever challenged their authenticity. And so it's just sort of petty stuff. It's sort of smashing windows, or it's putting up banners, or it's releasing people's private details online in order to pressure them. In one case, it was somebody who was willing to organize a coup for about, I can't remember, for about $150,000, including a few assassinations thrown in. And so you had effectively, I mean, we tend to look at it, and I can sometimes feel guilty about this, that I look at it and you think, you see a sort of guiding hand behind all of this. When if you go and talk to others, they see the sort of rolling chaos. And so this is a slight argument that in the detail, in the tactical detail, which is then subcontracted to individuals, you've got a sense of sort of slightly chaotic. What can we do for 10 grand? What can we do for $20,000? We'll do some protests. We'll bribe some journalists to cover it. We'll damage some buildings. But a lot of this then led from the nuts and bolts of politics and union politics somewhat, so it's protesting out on the streets, calling for this or calling for that, and then the creation of ethnic friction and potentially trying to create ethnic violence by smearing Azeris and then sort of blaming other people or doing news reports, again, fictitious news reports, saying that there were attacks on Azeris in Odessa to try to get sort of ethnic friction, all the way up to actually organized violence and to a campaign of terror, bombing of electricity supply stations, etc. So what the Circle of Leaks showed was the nuts and bolts, the bread and butter of Russian political warfare, from the very basic all the way through to the sort of overthrowing of the state and the creations of chaos, at which point the Russian military or paramilitary groups, i.e. GRU, FSB operatives, would then come in.
And to what extent? Because you've mentioned activные мероприятия, sort of
Yeah,
active measures pioneered by the Soviet Union.
yeah.
How different is the modern Russian version? And how far is it shaped by the fact that the modern regime is this curious hybrid between the intelligence services and essentially a mafia?
Okay, I think it's more flexible just because the Soviets only just worked with sort of naive church groups and naive peace groups. When, the modern day equivalent, they'll work with them, but they'll also work with very cynical bankers and, amoral lawyers, etc., etc. So I think there's more ideological flexibility there. Um, I think um, I think that actually the active measures is pretty much central to modern Russian warfare in the sense that it's very influential on it. And then again, if you look at the phasing of modern Russian operations, and clearly this won't include war in the Pacific or nuclear war, okay? Not at the end stage of that anyway. But if you look at modern Russian phasing of warfare, is very similar to the old KGB active measures of, you do deep sort of work over time, you create the conditions for chaos, you bring that state to crisis, you organize a coup d'etat, and then you normalize. And so you see that KGB doctrine writ large in the modern practice of phasing for military operations. And I discuss that in the book because I think it's important for military students, but also for the lay reader to understand what military phasing is and how you create effectively the overthrow of a state. And that is sort of what the KGB did, and that's also, very influential on modern Russian thinking about war. So I think active measures is very influential. And I think not least because Putin, I think, oversaw the redefining and the re-examination of theories of warfare. I think he probably took a personal interest in it. And I think the presidency and the presidential administration, I think, was very influential. What it clearly isn't Gerasimov's doctrine, because it's not primarily a military doctrine. And if you see what Gerasimov says, one way to interpret this is to say that Gerasimov is effectively telling the military, you may not think the Arab Spring, for example, is warfare, but actually that might be the warfare for our era and our century, in which case, whether we like it or not, we need to get our heads around it. He then says it's a shame there are so few thinkers that have got their heads around this in the Russian army. So he's basically admitting that the modern Russian military doctrine is certainly at a strategic level influenced not necessarily by soldiers, but by spies and the GRU sort of paramilitary special operations types who have got a real imprint into Russian theorizing about warfare and thinking about how about ways of war.
That's absolutely fascinating. Of course, with Putin there, you couldn't expect maybe anything else except the sort of spy mentality to filter down there. Another aspect of it I think was fascinating, and this becomes very, very difficult to identify. This is the use of so-called business networks,
Yeah.
and perhaps naivety in the West of not realizing that there's no such thing as an oligarch. There's no such thing as a Russian businessman. Everything is a resource of the state. People who are wealthy or able to conduct business do so with the approval of the state. That approval can be withdrawn. It is contingent upon loyalty. So, how far has Putin used the idea of business networks, criminal networks, asymmetric networks, and this idea of almost a sort of not even a feudal state, but a sort of pre-feudal state where there is no such thing as private property? Everything is an extension of state power.
It's one, if you, I mean, looking at it amorally, it is one of the most creative forms of the use of power and indeed the use of violence and the use of diplomacy that Putin has, or that Putin's regime has developed. And I think on a certain level, it's genius. And I don't mean it sort of, I don't mean that in a positive way. But I mean, it effectively, these oligarchs have done Russia's bidding, Putin's bidding, and you see their influence in Moldova, in Georgia. You saw their very considerable influence in eastern Ukraine, where they were buying up chunks of industry, where they funded the party of the regions. You see the work that they did in London. You see the work that they did elsewhere throughout the world, using their power and influence. But you're right. I mean, these are effectively a throwback to Tsarist era, where your landholding or your, industrial conglomerate and your billion in the bank is entirely dependent on keeping in favor with the Tsar. And if you lose that favor, you can be stripped of your holdings. So people who are oligarchs are effectively people who have been given a slice of state. Of the state, be it old oil or be it natural resources or be it in whatever. But they're given that as long as, well, some of them certainly are given that as long as they do the bidding of the state and the bidding of Putin, backing a party here, arranging for something bad to happen to somebody there, etc. So they are one of the most creative and fascinating parts of how Russia has constructed, or how Putin's regime has constructed power. And in Ukraine, they were extremely influential, working with the FSB to bankrupt and destroy rivals who were not controlled by the FSB and by the Kremlin. So they played a very, very important role in buying Ukrainian society and by buying Ukraine's elite.
This is perhaps one of the more contentious problems I see in the West, is that we are moving into an era of the increasing influence and concentration of wealth with oligarchs and oligarchic influence, and that essentially is, in my mind, corruptible. They don't have an interest in creating a level playing field for the
No.
majority of people, but they do have an interest in subverting it and ensuring they're not prosecuted, and legal limits and regulatory limits are lifted on their particular enterprises. We see this in AI. We're falling into a world which is perhaps ready-made for Putin's techniques.
Yes, it's becoming in some ways very dystopian. I mean, there are lots of wonderful things happening in the world, but there's some pretty dark things, happening with power and the rise of the new authoritarians, and the fact that once you get into power, you're quite keen to make sure that your opponents get arrested or something bad happens to them. So for sure, and this is why. I mean, this is another reason why I wrote the book, and in fact, I did the PhD into Russian warfare, because for me, it is a template for how regimes will fight against open societies, whether that's Iran fighting against Israel. I don't want to get involved in the whole Gaza-Palestine dynamic, but that's the Iranians are going to use that. They use religious violence, they use Hezbollah, and they've used Hamas, and they've used all these groups. They use religion in Bahrain. When it comes to China and its oppression of its own people and how it uses AI to spy on people increasingly, but also how it's tried to use Huawei to dominate Western 5G communications networks, and the incredible naivety of Western politicians in thinking that somehow Huawei is a private company. And then, of course, you've got, the Russian model, which contains everything, as indeed does China's. But what we've seen from China's is largely the economic elements of it, certainly thus far, with a little bit of espionage and sort of united front sort of influence peddling thrown in.
And authoritarian learning was one of fascinating conversation I had sort of last year with an academic who was with the Henry Jackson Society, sorry. And that's an interesting question, isn't it, as to whether Russia is a proxy in the big picture of China's overall long-term strategy, or
Yeah.
whether this is just a sort of authoritarian alignment of contingencies.
You see, I think I think we're splitting hairs pointlessly, because actually, regardless of what it is, if, and again, sorry, I don't want to go back to everyone always, too many historical analogies always go back to the 1930s and Hitler, but spare me this one. Did it matter why Germany and Japan were aligned? Did it really matter why Italy and Germany were aligned? And so when people, I've read lots of articles saying, well, China and Russia don't see eye to eye on this and don't see eye to eye on that. Yeah, that's not really the point. And every time, somebody says, oh, the relationship is bound to cool, it seems to sort of rise up another level. And again, if you look at the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and, what was happening there just over the last sort of 24 hours, you'll see that point. So I think they are becoming closely aligned. I think for sure it doesn't. They're somewhat built on mistrust of each other, and I think a lot of Russians hate Chinese, and I think the Chinese probably look down on the Russian leadership, and see it as effectively increasingly a raw materials colony and potentially just a bigger version of North Korea with which to threaten the West. But that's not really the point. The point is their interests are aligning, combining, and I think we need to stop worrying about how close they are and just say they're pretty close. They're both going to be using non-military forms of conflict against the West, and we just need to accept that and actually limit the damage that they can do to us.
And that's extraordinary, isn't it? Because on the one hand, you have people who perhaps are, pro-Ukrainian, say, okay, well, China and Russia, as you say, they're not fully aligned, blah, blah, blah. That's strategy based on hopeful thinking. Then you have the absolutely delusional end, which is many in the Trump team, the sort of geopolitical analysts within his team who are saying, but we can split them apart, which is clearly not working particularly well.
No.
If, however, we take us as the outliers who are somewhat cynical about this and think that this collaboration can go in all sorts of directions, which are rather unpleasant for us. One of those could be obviously the invasion of Taiwan. One of those could be either timed with that or not necessarily, but it could be the challenging of Article 5 and Article 5 provocation. And in fact, we've seen today a sort of indirect attack on Ursula von der Leyen as her plane had to land using paper maps. And as you mentioned earlier in the episode, we've seen a direct attacks on European, American, and British assets in Ukraine. It seems we're already on a trajectory towards a full Article 5 provocation, whether or not Russia does that in alignment with China or not.
I think if China strikes against Taiwan, and increasingly people are saying it's when, not if, then the idea that Russia won't align is just nonsense. Of course they will, because the Americans will be overwhelmingly focused on Taiwan, and the Russians will potentially throw more. I mean, what more looks like is up for debate, but they will throw more at Ukraine and potentially more at the Baltic republics, because the Americans will be either preoccupied elsewhere or won't be interested in defending Europe, depending, where we are with Trump in a year or three. So the idea that they won't align and they won't consult, I just think is absolute nonsense. Of course they will. Russia would absolutely act opportunistically if the world's attention is focused on Chinese attempts to either strangle Taiwan slowly or invade it quickly.
Another area of, I think, has been extraordinary distraction and delusion, deflection, whether intentionally or not, has been this constant debate about whether the Russian people are going to rise up, whether the oligarchs and the elite are opposed to Putin and blah, blah, blah. It
It's waste
seems
of
the
time.
key question that's not been asked is, are the intelligence services and military intelligence actually fully aligned with Putin's war state, his transformation of Russia into a militarized police state? Our default assumption as naive Westerners is that this doesn't make any sense. This is not economically rational. Therefore, there are going to be whole segments of the elite there that oppose it. Whereas I rather suspect from sort of Russian history and what we're seeing that they've made it beneficial to huge chunks of
Yeah, this
society.
is again, this is another sort of I think I mean it's great that we're discussing it, but it's a pointless conversation. Maybe maybe there'll be some bunt in a year's time that will start in Bashkortostan or somewhere and spread like wildfire, like some Arab Spring, but I really can't see it. I think Putin has re-energized well, sort of a sort of limited totalitarianism in the Russian Federation, and the idea that he's going to be overthrown is absolutely for the birds. I think the oligarchs or the rich have been brought on side because they've got some of the spoils of the war, so they're doing well. A lot of people in the provinces who are living in dirt poor towns forgotten by Russia, which were once sort of arms industry towns, are now doing pretty well. So there's a lot of money going out to poorer parts of Russia, either in arms or in payment for soldiers, and if you've got a large family and you can persuade some slightly backward cousin Ivan to go off and fight and get himself killed, then you've got tens of thousands of dollars coming your way, which is life-changing amounts of money for some people. So I think I think there is a lot of people suddenly profiting from this war. I think a more intelligent question is, if this war stops, what are the problems that Putin is going to face when all that money into the provinces and into sort of one factory town suddenly sort of suddenly turns dry. That well suddenly turns dry. And also what happens when you've got hundreds of thousands of severely traumatized PTSD'd soldiers who are committing rapes, committing murders, and actually just being a violent menace in the communities they go back to.
I mean, that's already happening. An interesting story,
It's
I think it was
yeah,
in Medusa or one of those about the front line of that, which of course is Russia's prostitutes who are
yeah,
at the front line of these returning, psychopaths and
yeah.
traumatized soldiers, and it's not pretty. It's kind of grim. But then the regime is not going to give two hoots about that. Let's turn, I think, finally. Well, one I wanted to quickly mention because you mentioned child abduction, you mentioned cyber attacks, and you make a link that these two things really don't gel in our minds as being, part of the same strategy. But I think you're trying to say that this is all part of a hybrid strategy: war crimes, crimes against humanities, as well as cutting edge cyber warfare,
Jonathan,
EW, and
yeah.
everything else.
Just because we don't think something is a tool of war, it doesn't mean the Russians don't think it's a tool of war. And the reality is, because this is a very, very deliberate strategy, it is a tool of war, whether we like it or not. We tend to think sort of child abduction, significant human rights abuses are bad things that happen alongside the business of war, according to a narrow definition. But actually, the child abduction is absolutely part and parcel of the Russian strategy because it wants to deprogram Ukrainian children. It wants to deprogram children in the occupied territories to stop them being Ukrainian, speaking Ukrainian, sort of thinking about Ukrainian history or reading it. And it wants to impose a forced Russification on them. That's absolutely part of this war. So the relentless cyber attacks. So clearly is the incredible evolution in drones. So clearly is the disinformation. And there are dozens, I think I probably counted about 110. There are dozens, if not well over 100 tools of this integrated warfare outside the sort of conventional use of war for a conventional purpose. So, a platoon attack or a regiment attack, which is, a military attack on a military target, I don't include in that definition. But if you include everything else from, strikes on electricity in order to have a psychological impact on people, all the way through to child abduction to, disinformation, then there are dozens of tools of this form of a new form of integrated warfare, which the Russian regime sees as being tools of conflict, regardless of whether we do.
The last question has to be, of course, what is to be done? Because if we have a Russia which is not economically rational in any sense that we would, think of that, and we're still trying to impose that or trying to understand them through that framework of our own economic and diplomatic rationality, and yet their intent on outsourcing violence to criminal networks in our society, their intent on asymmetric attacks, which actually have no limit to the scale they can deploy at the moment. We're just seeing, I would say, the sort of the testing exercises, testing the water, toe in the water.
Mhm.
How do we contain a hybrid war from a fully militarized, almost chained to a psychopath kind of scenario? I mean, Ukrainians understand this, and actually they are getting hit with a full gamut of this. But how do we in the West work on a containment strategy for this lunacy, this aggressive lunacy?
Firstly, is that we understand it, and one of the reasons I've written this book is because I don't think people understand it. I mean, some people do. I'm sure you do, Jonathan. But people in government, no. Even soldiers, no, not really. People in business, no. So they don't get this form of warfare. They don't get that, Huawei was a tool of the Chinese regime to dominate the 5G market. They don't understand its importance. And clearly, with the Russian stuff, when it comes to sort of corrupt banking and lawyers or whatever, they just don't get the extensive tools and nature of these new forms of integrated total war. And so I wanted to explain that. So the first thing is understanding. Secondly, you have to see we can't let soldiers do the thinking about warfare. Even with the best will in the world, British soldiers tend to veer towards the conventional warfare and their understanding of it. And this is a whole society and a whole state problem. And you need input from politicians, you need input from spies, you need input from academics and people who understand this. And there aren't that many. So you need a way of looking at this and understanding it holistically and then taking action. And you should not be scared to take action. So, we are 2, 3 years behind in terms of understanding of drone warfare. That should be an absolute priority, literally an emergency priority to make sure that soldiers in the battalions along the front line in the Baltic republics are trained up in the use of drones. Because any chaos, I mean, I suspect it's not just going to be a straightforward attack, although you never know with Putin. There'll probably be a sort of paramilitary political element building up, causing of chaos, etc. But drones are going to feature. Whether that's going to be a so-called Russian paramilitary group or Estonian fascists, in inverted commas, i.e., FSB dressed up as Estonian fascists, dropping 50 drones onto a football match or whether it is a drone attack, out of the blue on, the NATO battalion in Estonia, who knows? But when push comes to shove and the conventional war starts, the first morning, NATO troops are going to have to work out how to deal with 10,000 drones coming their way, and they won't have a clue. And at that point, Western forces will be overrun really very quickly. And Putin doesn't have to seize all of these countries, although he'll probably try to eventually. He just has to take the Russian-speaking elements in two. Not even that the Russians in those places would necessarily want or welcome in any way, shape, or form Putin. And in fact, some of them may be killed by provocateurs, by Asian provocateurs, in order to create those provocations, provocatsia. Yeah. So they may be the greatest victims of Putin. That is not the point. They will be manipulated and used. And people amongst them, whether they're from the area or not, ethnic Russians will be used in order to portray themselves as being victims and wanting Putin's armies there. And all Putin has to move into what, Latuva and Narva, hold them, refuse to leave, defeat any NATO troops that come near, and he has destroyed NATO. And that's his life ambition achieved. And right now, I can't see that not happening. And I really worry about what NATO's response is going to be because there's two countries in the world that do drone warfare, that do modern ground warfare. One is Ukraine and one is Russia. Neither of them are in NATO.
We have certainly challenging times ahead, and I think we are still outliers along with a handful of other people, but the the dread of what is about to befall. I think we have some realization of that. That's why your book is so important. That's why I strongly encourage the audience to really engage with it, not just buy it and skim it, but really engage with the topics in there. This should be, I think, tucked into every rucksack of every soldier across Europe, as well as every politician. But fingers crossed we get to that point.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. Thank you.
A final word from our partners, the makers of Kiev of Mine. All three films are now available to watch for free on YouTube. Please check out the links to the dedicated website, which tells you more about the film, its subjects, and the filmmakers. Also in the description is a link to the YouTube channel where you can watch the films now. Do let us know in the comments what you think of them and if they inspire you as much as they have inspired me.